Good evening, everyone. I have 2 words for yesterday's election, and they are womp womp. Although I think that might just be one. You guys can split the difference with me. Not all of my predictions came true. For example, Lee Zeldin didn't pull out New York. We'll talk about him. I talked about, who else? Stacey Abrams losing. I was correct about that. John Fetterman somehow managed to make Pennsylvania happen, which was really intriguing to me. Lots of different reasons that might have happened, but all of this was super interesting. I had a great time catching up with Lauren Chen and Lauren Southern and their stream full of left-leaning guys last night. That was a lot of fun for sure too. We got really distracted and didn't talk a whole lot about the election, but we still had fun. Enjoyed the conversation for sure. And I'm not going to be a Debbie Downer today. I think that what happened yesterday was unfortunate. I don't think it's the end of the world. I realized before the show, too, that my hair is super crazy. I do look like Hermione in that regard as well, so just bear with me while I try to keep it under control. I'm going to try to be as upbeat as possible. I was just listening to Ben Shapiro, and he was down. He was pretty ticked off, but I don't think that's the right mode to operate from. I think it's very much like a phase. You can be upset about it for a little while, but then it's time to go on and do awesome stuff. Let's see what my husband says. Yes, obviously I was campaigning all night for Fetterman. Good work, Andy. Thank you for that. You saved him for sure. So let's get into it. Let's talk about what happened, what some of the best parts were. So I'm going to start with my favorite part, and we'll talk about some other good conservative leadership and what resulted from that. So this is my most favorite part from last night. This is Ron DeSantis blowing out Florida, like 60-40. Yep, 60-40. He got something like 62 out of 65 counties to go for him. I don't know if you guys remember in 2018, Ron DeSantis won by 0.4% against Andrew Gillum, and he has turned Florida into a red state. I remember a time when Florida was purple. No more. He even won Miami-Dade. I don't know anything about Florida, so I'm not sure how they lean exactly. But I was told, I gathered over the course of the evening, that Miami-Dade was untouchable for Republicans for a very long time. But Ron DeSantis did it, even after being called Ron DeSanctimonious by Trump. So this has been a really interesting kind of analysis over the last few days of Trump's influence. So we'll talk about that for sure as well. But Ron DeSantis was one of the best sources of conservative leadership in Florida. There were a couple things he did right. He was consistently conservative, and he talked about culture war issues that actually affected people. So he wasn't doing the Republican thing where he's just talking about cutting taxes. He was talking about stuff that people really actually cared deeply about, talking about their kids, talking about keeping their state safe from natural disasters and stuff like that. In all practical ways, he was pretty much the role model Republican, and look how his state turned out. You know what we need? We need more of that. But there were a couple other instances of positivity last night. And one of the things I think is going to get overlooked if I don't bring it up is Lee Zeldin. So even though I was incorrect about him winning his election last night, he still managed to change the tide in New York. And we're going to talk about how. Here's his statement about losing to Kathy Hochul. Let me minimize my messages. Congratulations, Kathy Hochul, on her election to a full term. This once-in-a-generation campaign was a very close margin in the bluest of states, and that's what I want to talk about. If not for the dedicated hard work of grassroots volunteers and supporters, this incredibly close race would not have been possible. Let's see what he says. Today, Congressman Lee Zeldin, the Republican Party and Conservative Party nominee for governor of New York, issued the following statement on election results. I'd like to congratulate New York Governor Kathy Hochul on her election to a full 4-year term. This race is a once-in-a-generation campaign with a very close margin in the bluest of blue states. The unrelenting passion and hard work of our grassroots volunteers and supporters made this incredibly close race possible and helped us win at least 49 of New York's 62 counties. Wow. Republicans, Democrats, and Independents united as New Yorkers, pouring their heart and soul into this campaign. Those controlling Albany should take note. New Yorkers of all walks of life are sick of the attacks on their wallets, their safety, their freedoms, and the quality of their kids' education, and are hitting their breaking point as proven by these results. As they take office in January, Governor Kathy Hochul and those controlling Albany must address the grave concerns voiced by the voters. While this campaign has come to a close, the rescue mission to save our state continues. Good for him, and I will tell you guys why. He ran, first of all, he gave up his seat, his former position, because he really wanted to run in New York City. Honestly, good for him. The reason that I think that he did the right thing is because of stuff like this. Republicans pick up 3 New York House seats with a Long Island sweep and defeat of the DCC chair. The victories could prove decisive in how large a majority House Republicans stand to gain, proving that New York was, as expected, a critical battleground. It was critical, and he gave those Democrats a run for their money. And even though he himself didn't win, he brought over 3 New York House seats, like they're saying, with his Long Island sweep. Again, I don't know much about New York. That's not my home state, anything like that. But I was so impressed that a Republican was able to make such ground in this blue state. Bluest of the blue, honestly, like he said. We don't really need to get into it. Hold on, let me see. Yeah, no worries. But he was able to bring a lot of candidates along with him on his coattail. And this is why these Republicans were able to win in New York. Like, good for him, honestly. So we have Ron DeSantis and Lee Zeldin leading good conservative campaigns, and they did well. Even if not by typical standards, I still think that they did really well by the standards of, for example, their states. Like Ron DeSantis has totally turned around Florida, and then Lee Zeldin is making inroads in New York. Like, good for him. Let's see what other candidates did well. I see that JD Vance won, and I'm seeing that Blake Masters is favored to win. But again, we don't know everything about Arizona at this point yet, because it turns out that Katie Hobbs, who was running against Carrie Lake, is their Secretary of State and was supposed to check their voting machines, and for some reason their voting machines didn't work in Maricopa County, in the reddest part of the county. Isn't that so weird? Mind blown. I cannot say, but I think it must be a huge conflict of interest for a Secretary of State to also be running for governor and still serving those, like, filling that role. That is crazy to me. I want to read the rules in Arizona about that. That's nuts. But I digress. Let's look at some other positivity. So Rand Paul tweeted, "Every libertarian-leaning Republican in Congress we feature often on Liberty Tree won their elections by double digits." Rand Paul, Thomas Massey pulled it out, JD Vance did it, Ron Johnson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and then the governors, Brian Kemp in Georgia and Abbott in Texas. They were all able to win. They were all able to hold on to their positions. They were all able to make that positive conservative leadership. And I think one of the things that they all had in common, except Marjorie Taylor Greene perhaps, none of them were outright endorsed by Trump, which was an interesting thing to notice. And as we know, Ron DeSantis was slammed by Trump at his previous event. Like, he called him Ron DeSanctimonious. It was a little bit disrespectful, but that tells me that Trump views him as a bit of a threat. We're going to talk a little bit about Trump. But let's talk about how weird this election was. I have a whole thread from John Hayward, who writes for Breitbart. So let's read a little bit of it, see if you guys agree with him. I kind of think I do agree with him, but you guys let me know what you think. "It's one of the strangest elections on the books, as I witnessed the shock among so many on the Democrat side that they did so well. They somehow managed to defy political gravity despite the worst wrong track numbers in memory. Probably no single explanation, but a few factors. So let's read them. To get the most obvious out of the way, a lot of people are yelling fraud. Some hinky stuff happened, and apparently we'll have to put up with that forever because the electorate does not insist on clean, efficient elections even after the states like Florida's prove it's possible. That's another thing that Florida did. They made their elections squeaky clean, and they had all of their ballots counted within like 1 hour of closing. Fraud does not explain nationwide results, though. Better to consider that Dems took advantage of the pandemic to loosen voter rules to an absolutely insane degree, and they're absolute masters at harvesting what we might politely refer to as the indifferent voter. What's the point of talking about momentum, late-breaking events, or even how candidates perform at debates when a huge chunk of the vote is banked by mail before the debates even happen? Robotic party line voters and harvesting matter more than campaign skill. I think he's entirely right. I think a lot of what we were seeing for Fetterman was from the early voting. And I think that's why they delayed that debate as long as possible. But I think I mentioned that in another video. Second, candidate quality matters, and it matters a lot more for the party that doesn't have a massive ballot harvesting machine humming away to scoop up indifferent voters early. This was painfully illustrated in Pennsylvania, the true bellwether race of this election. Many GOP candidates did well in tough areas, but they just couldn't close the deal. That has a lot to do with candidate quality. Think of the old maxim that you only get one chance to make a first impression. That's even more important in an era of absurdly loose early voting. If scads of mail-in votes are harvested before there are even debates, then the campaign doesn't matter as much. You can run a tight campaign, make it all the right moves while your opponent implodes, and still come up short because you got off on the wrong foot. That's an environment that obviously favors incumbents who already got elected and have a huge bankrolls of money and power over challengers who have to introduce themselves, and it really cuts against outsider challengers without political resumes or establishment support. The only real red tsunami of the midterm election in Florida featured incumbent Republicans with very solid resumes and excellent political machines. DeSantis shook the pillars of heaven in a state he originally won by a squeaker against a drug-addled train wreck Dem. Yeah, Andrew Gillum was not doing well by the time that election rolled around. I do remember that. Third, and relatedly, money matters. A lot. You don't hear any media bellyaching about money in politics this time around because Democrats had oceans of it. We laugh at the proven loser Dems like Abrams and Beto who wasted millions, but believe me, Dems had plenty to waste. Money always matters in politics. It might not overwhelm everything else. We love stories of the underfunded David taking out establishment Goliath, but it's a huge factor. It lets you blast your message to voters, and Dems got billions of in-kind donations from their media. Of course they did. We know this. Media are 100% oppositional as far as we're concerned. Dems have also have very powerful political machines in the cities they control, which churn out votes like a factory punching out widgets. Some of those machines are a century old and more. It takes money, time, and skill to build operations that can fight back. Fourth, movement and polarization are a real factor. An opportunity in some ways for the GOP, a problem in others. It's striking how closely Zeldin's heartbreaking loss in New York tracks with the number of people who fled the Dem train wreck in New York. Votes have been cast with feet. That's a great point. I think that DeSantis' win in Florida was 100% bolstered by all the people leaving New York who would have voted for Lee Zeldin. People are moving around between states to the suburbs. It's not really a new phenomenon. Think back to the white flight debate of decades past. Badly governed jurisdictions tend to get worse as reasonable people flee. Failure doubles down again and again. The GOP's best bet is to reach people in death spiral blue areas with the message that they can do better. Things can change, but it's not easy. It's only possible if you're running candidates who convince those voters they can govern well with a nationwide election narrative. Didn't really see much of a national election narrative from the GOP this time around. I think that might have been part of it. Dems definitely had one with abortion panic and Biden's Mussolini speeches. They made a desperate play to shore up their base, and it worked extremely well. Now for a couple of things that may not be easy to hear. 1. The pandemic changed this country for the long term, and not at all in a good way. A certain despair has settled in, a sense that things can't be any better, and we really don't deserve better. It's sunk in deep. I personally would blame a lot of the environmental stuff for that as well. I think the whole "we don't really deserve better" comes straight from that, and I'm not convinced it's going to go away. We have a lot of work ahead of us. That's one reason Dems defied those wrong track, mad as hell numbers that had so many Dem analysts nervous yesterday morning. Sure, 70% or 85% or whatever say wrong track, but what does that mean if so many buy lefty spin that it can't get better, that we deserve decline? That is a very interesting note. The pandemic brought a deep and enduring shift toward the desire for government-provided security at all costs in numerous issues. It dovetails with mail-in voting, which is perfect for reaching the laptop class that arose during lockdowns, valuing handouts over opportunity 100%. These laptop class are our elites. These are journalists, and these are the people who are valuing all of these changes to elections. Mail-in voting being among those issues. This happened at a time when the left's control of institutional power became near absolute. With the capture of large corporations, they gained control of every large institution that influenced the attitudes of young and suburban voters. The pandemic magnified that influence. Look at how successful the Dems' despicable strategy of boosting the very GOP candidates they screamed were a threat to democracy itself was. They won every single race they used that tactic in, didn't they? That stuff only works if you have overwhelming institutional control. Great observation. Likewise with abortion, which was fascinatingly underpolled going into the election. Poll after poll said voters were far more concerned about inflation, crime, etc., and yet on election night we got all these exit polls saying it effectively erased the economy as an issue. That's raw institutional power at work, wielded over the course of generations. Mail-in ballots cast at the height of post-Dodd pushback were a big reason polls from the fall that showed abortion receding as an issue were wrong. The pro-abortion reflex ran deep in some quarters. It's true that the electorate writ large doesn't like either extreme on abortion, but eliminating abortion was more clearly on the ballot this time around, so the vote against it mobilized. I said at the time pro-lifers should give voters more time to adjust to the new reality. He was definitely right about that. Vast fortresses of institutional power are defeated with patient strategy and persistence. Siege warfare, not all or nothing cavalry charges. GOP needs to get better at changing the electorate. Yes, social engineering. Dems do it all day, every day without mercy or hesitation. We will talk about what that looks like for conservatives at the end of this video. Last bit. Look, I know saying a word about Trump or Trump versus DeSantis is going to unleash a flood of strong responses. You guys put them there in the chat. I don't care. Come at me. We're going to get into it and see what happens. Let's see. Nobody's position on that hot button issue will change because of a tweet. I thought last night's results wrote a message in the sky with letters of fire. I don't know what YMMV stands for. The sum of everything we saw last night argues for smart strategy, a proven record of accomplishments, wisely choosing battles that matter, and making careful investments of political capital. Wavering voters and nervous folks like visionaries who also demonstrate competence. They like visionaries. Yeah, okay. You just can't get around the fact that Dems put Trump on the ballot with all their caterwauling about January 6th and democracy in peril and ran very well against him. He's got major negatives that aren't going away. You may think that's unfair, but it's true. Trump has baggage from the pandemic that turns off people who might otherwise vote red. He sat on a pile of money that could have helped in the midterms. He splits up the GOP while Dems grow ever more horrifyingly united under totalitarian ideology. Trump certainly does have strengths which his ardent detractors underestimate, and his admin did better on many key issues pre-pandemic than even he can articulate. But the pandemic did happen. 2020 happened. Last night showed Dems will win if we never leave 2020 behind. Want to know how Dems won PA with a guy who has a serious brain damage? Same way they put a senile disaster in the White House and then weathered the midterms. Party power, institutional control, ideological unity, a machine that spits out votes, even if the candidate is a turnip. Wow, that thread is really incisive, and I really appreciate what he had to say. I know that he's undoubtedly getting tons of backlash for what he had to say about Trump. In fact, I'm kind of curious what the first response is. Is that Trump? Oh, no, okay, so he's talking about, the first comment is talking about Florida. Very interesting. On the topic of Trump, let's look at how he handled last night's events. We have this tweet from Josh Hammer that says, "Why do this? Why?" And this is in response to Donald Trump saying, now that the election in Florida is over and everything went quite well, shouldn't it be said that in 2020, I got 1.1 million more votes in Florida than Ron D got this year? 5.7 million to 4.6 million. Just asking, question mark. I don't see this as good conservative leadership. I don't view this as unifying the party in any way. This is Donald Trump using his ego to make an ego-based point about Ron DeSantis. And I agree with Allie Beth Stuckey, who says he's doing this because he doesn't like how much attention and affirmation DeSantis is getting. I cannot and will not disagree with that. This is one of Trump's biggest faults, and this is really what cut him down. He wanted everyone to like him. This is why he did all of those interviews with mainstream media, and I'm not going to turn this into a rant about Trump. Incredibly frustrated with him, incredibly frustrated with the people who say that Ron DeSantis cannot win an effective, he cannot run an effective campaign with Trump in the picture. And I will continue to say, as I have consistently said, I think that Donald Trump needs to bow out. I think he needs to leave the political landscape. I think that he could consider himself a kingmaker and he could call a lot of these shots. But I will also say that he chose candidates that he later abandoned, which was so fascinating to me. He raised all this money. He endorsed a bunch of candidates, including Dr. Oz, who failed in Pennsylvania. And then he's criticizing these people he chose because they ended up losing. Trump criticizes Colorado, New Hampshire GOP Senate nominees after losses. And he 100% endorsed a lot of these people and then turned on them before they even had a chance to prove that they were worth the time. And people like Dr. Oz was the least GOP candidate I've ever seen. He was 100% pro-transing the kids, I believe, even before it was cool. He ran against John Fetterman and he lost. I will say no more about Dr. Oz. I'm not impressed with Donald Trump's choice of celebrity over all else. I don't think it's the right strategy. It's clearly not what we need. Okay, so what's the silver lining to all of this stuff? It looks like good conservative leadership wins, bad conservative leadership costs offices. Let's see what Joe Biden is saying in response. Asked what he intends to do differently in the next 2 years, President Biden responds, nothing. Because they're only just finding out what we're doing. I view this as such a harbinger of what's going to happen. I think this is a serious issue that we all need to understand. What's going to happen in the coming few years is that the Democrats are going to double down. They think that what they're doing is working. And in some ways, like in that thread we just talked about, it is. But in other ways, I think they're going to be surprised. I suspect that doubling down is going to be their weakness. And I think that we'll see what happens in 2024. I'm very curious. This past election was expected to be a referendum on everything the Democrats had done wrong. It was not enough of a referendum. GOP did not offer enough of a strategic response. And that is entirely our loss. We need to own that. Today is the day to have the humility to look at what actually happened and try to figure out what we're doing better going forward. So let's talk about what it would look like for a positive conservative movement to surface and what we're going to have to do to make some of this happen. So this is an article that Andy recommended that I thought was awesome. I think it's a really neat look at some of the underlying issues that Gen Z, because the polling number, I meant to pull this up. I already have too much pulled up, but I meant to discuss what it looks like when Gen Z votes. These younger people are voting overwhelmingly blue. And I think what that guy was talking about, John Hayward, about how people feel like we deserve everything to be terrible, that's 100% a Gen Z thing. Gen Z are the ones who are out there protesting for the climate because they think that the world is ending. They've been effectively lied to. This is part of the institutions being on the side of the Democrats. This is the schools. This is regular education. This is higher education. This is everyone who's talking to these kids saying that the world is going to end. And you need to accept that you're going to, for example, live in the pod and eat the bugs. So let's talk about this article from Not the Bee a little bit. This is from Joel Abbott. If you want Gen Z to stop voting woke, then stop complaining and give them a better hope for the future. Yes, yes, yes. So much. So one of the things that I mentioned in my own election analysis thread, I talked about a man who ran with Jordan Peterson's ideas and sense of persuasion and his charisma, probably a little more than Jordan Peterson, but someone who runs with those ideas is really going to hit it out of the park when it comes to Gen Z. That's exactly what this article is saying. I completely agree with him. Let's unpack this a little bit. Many of you fine ladies and gentlemen from older generations have learned to understand the ins and outs of what we affectionately call clown world, the cosmopolitan high temple that the woke cult calls home. You've learned about critical race and queer theory. You've come to understand the arguments of the anti-racist peddling racism and revisionist history. But I was born in a different generation. I straddle the line between the youngest generations that are currently able to vote. I was born just before the Berlin Wall came down. I was only 10 when everyone freaked out about Y2K, and I was barely 12 when the Twin Towers fell. So this guy's about my age. I was in high school when YouTube and Facebook and other social platforms took off, and I was barely in college when Obama was elected and the Great Recession kicked off. While I'm often told that I'm a 90-year-old man in a millennial body, I'm the oldest of my family, and my wife is the oldest of her family. Our younger siblings, cousins, and friends extend well into Gen Z. As such, I see the generational differences between many older millennials and this younger group of 20-somethings, which is why this doesn't surprise me. This is a tweet from @endwokeness. The GOP was busy fighting for more corporate tax breaks while woke culture revolutionaries took over our schools. Last night, the 18 to 29 age group went to Democrats by 28 points. Not by accident, decades in the making while we were asleep at the wheel. Yes. One of the largest failings of Republicans is the refusal to acknowledge that any age group other than perhaps boomers and some of Gen X exists at all. And including like any kind of outreach to the Hispanic community, any kind of outreach to any other culture, were just totally off limits. And I fail to understand why that was ever it. But I think that was definitely the neocon influence. But I digress about that. I feel like enough's been said about the neocons. There's enough to criticize there. John Della Volpe says, one thing I know already, if not for voters under 30, tonight would have been a red wave. CNN National House exit poll, R plus 13, 65 and up, R plus 11, 45 to 64, D plus 2, 30 to 44, D plus 28, 18 through 29. Gen Z did their job. This is the result of state schooling. Changed my mind. I'm fully willing to accept that the state experiment with schooling our children has been an abject failure, and I've been pushing homeschooling for as long as I can remember. I was homeschooled myself. It's only made me a little bit slow. No, I'm just kidding. It's made me a little bit maybe socially maladapted, but I 100% am so glad that my parents went out of their way to make sure that I was kind of sheltered from this stuff. For decades, the left has built an intersectional coalition based on minority groups. If they could convince Latinos, blacks, gays, and Muslims that racist white Republicans wanted to enslave them, then they'd have a path to power. Genius in its simplicity. Since the left's economic policies will always result in what we're currently seeing at the grocery store and the gas pump, this strategy was most of their selling point. The problem is, and always was, that groups like deeply Catholic Latinos and Muslims bent on Sharia law were never going to follow godless Marxist revolutionaries into the gender-bending rainbow over the horizon. The coalition could not hold, and this is some of what we saw in, I believe it was Michigan, Ann Arbor, when the Muslim parents and the Christian parents got together to protest their kids being taught this ridiculous gender nonsense. The fact that some areas are now seeing 20% of blacks vote Republican and that liberal Hispanic strongholds like Miami are turning red for Ron DeSantis proves that this coalition formed in the late 20th century is beginning its inevitable end. But leftists have a backup plan. The students they began aggressively indoctrinating in neo-Marxist groupthink about 30 years ago. Womp womp. It isn't coincidence that some of the founding papers of the critical race theory, for example, were published in the late 80s and early 90s. This is when the aggressive push to radically change and control education began. Young people with lots of passion and little mature understanding of the world have always been useful revolutionaries, 100%. It isn't until later in life that many of them realize how they've been used by the old tyrants to obtain more power on the tyrant's behalf. Such was the lament of Erich Maria Remarque, the author of All Quiet on the Western Front, and his scathing rebuke of the learned men that sent their sons to the slaughter in World War I. Such was the lament of the fictional Anakin Skywalker, who sold his soul to make an old politician into a galactic emperor and became Darth Vader in the process. Yeah, and then his gif of Anakin saying, "What have I done?" The millennial generation was old enough so they escaped the worst of the indoctrination. It wasn't until high school and college that I hit the mainstream woke cult curriculum that's common in preschool today. Gen Z grew up in a different time. A time already ruled by the tech activists that controlled what content they would see. A time with easy access to the personal thoughts of woke celebrities that they idealize on Instagram, on TikTok. A time when, with no restraints on graphic sex and graphic violence obtained for free at the touch of a button. A time where society had already discarded God and objective truth in favor of personal experience and self-determination. A time when the corruption of ancient 20th century leaders has given them a stranglehold over the institutions around us. A time when people say there is little left to explore and few adventures left to be had. It's very sad. Gen Z deeply cares about many issues in the world. They simply have a different religious worldview than older generations. Few of them know anything about the societal traditions and roots that formed them. They know little of history or the great works of literature that used to form classical education. Copy editor, guys. 200 years ago, the poorest farm boy could quote the Bible, and most had a passing understanding of writings from Alexander Hamilton, John Locke, Shakespeare, Aristotle, and other great thinkers and philosophers. George Orwell wrote, the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. This isn't just happening in our society. It has happened. It's past tense. Gen Z is concerned about finding their identities and saving the planet, not making commitments, pledging themselves to marriage and parenthood, and certainly not to obeying God. They want to experience life to the full, like the Roman and Greek hedonists of old. This is the end stage of postmodernism. If you are an older American who hoped the MAGA movement could save the nation, it was never going to. Trump, for all his flaws, was the one who revealed that the foundation of the house was rotten, but he was never going to be the one to fix it. The only way to do that, my friends, is to accept that the tree is dead and plant a new one. This is a great thesis, and this is what I was talking about with Jordan Peterson's ideas. Jordan Peterson is currently doing a 3-part special with the Daily Wire Plus where he talks about marriage. He recently had Josh Hawley on his program, and they talked about the importance of marriage for young men. He's been pushing these ideas nonstop, and I'm really going to kind of bury the lead on this one because this is going to be my closing statement. I think conservatism has everything that young people are looking for. I think that this offers them the change that they hoped to see in the world when they were born. Everything that young people are going for right now, they have been lied to about. They have been lied to about whether the world is ending. They literally don't even know if the global warming is going to be the end of us or not. There was a young lady who tied herself to the top of a bridge in the UK, and she was beside herself. She said, I shouldn't have to do this. I shouldn't have to be out here. And I said, you're absolutely correct. You should not. You've been lied to. You're a useful idiot. It's because you're young. I don't blame you. But I think those people should be punished, but punishing the symptom of the issue is not fixing the problem. And I think that Joel is right when he says that the only way to do that is accept that the tree is dead and plant a new tree. And that's what I think Jordan Peterson is doing. I'm going to leave you guys with this note. I think that this is something conservatives have that Democrats do not. And I would love to see all of us start pushing this idea. Joel goes on to say this has happened many times in history, whether civilization was wiped out by a plague or invasion, or whether a new one simply eclipsed the old. There is nothing new under the sun. How we do that is simple, though many don't want to hear it. First, we order our lives around God's standard, his measuring line for what life means and how we are to live it. Then we do what is now countercultural. We lead simple lives as devoted spouses and parents committed to raising our children in the way they should go so they will not depart from it. This is how the West was won. And I 100% agree with him. I want to show you guys this meme that he threw into his article. Honestly, good for him. I think it's great. This is a meme that's been going around. And this is kind of in line with a meme that my friends constantly send me. It's like, men only want one thing and it's effing disgusting. And it's like a picture of a man and his wife and his family. Obviously, the lady in question was originally saying that men only want to, for example, hook up or get lucky or get laid or whatever. I don't think that's what people really want. The woman who thought that men only want one thing and it's effing disgusting was wrong. What people actually want is something that they haven't even come to terms with themselves. They've been so deeply lied to at every level. You have young children who come home. Greta Thunberg talked about how she would come home and be so incredibly upset. She wouldn't eat. She wouldn't think. All she would be is just so concerned constantly about the environment. This is something that she was told. She is their useful person to carry this water for them. What's actually going to make people happy and fulfilled is to pursue the old traditions. And this might be something that you guys don't even want to hear. I know I have atheists in my audience. Plenty of you guys are agnostic. I was for quite a while. I'm really starting to come around though, because I see the powerful truth that having a religious focus holds for people. And I don't think that I think that what we're seeing now is the end result of telling people lies for far too long. I think that someone like Jordan Peterson, who comes out and says, you need to accept more responsibility. In fact, you need to pick up the heaviest thing you can find and carry it as well as you can. Even if you can't do that yet, you can at least clean your room. You can at least make the world a little bit more ordered in your own personal sphere. I think that a conservative who comes out and says that to young people is going to have a Jordan Peterson-like influence on them. And I think I honestly think, I thought for a while that we really need the feminine equivalent of Jordan Peterson for ladies. I think that women especially need to be told this because they've been lied to so deeply through feminism. I need someone who will come along and say that that was all complete nonsense, and it turns out that what we actually wanted before we entered the workforce and all got hooked on antidepressants was to have a family and to provide the role of a wife to our husbands. And it's so interesting to me reading what the Bible thinks about wives, because if you read what Psalms and Proverbs has to say about married people, there is such a wholesome balance between the male and the female, and there is so much credit given to the virtuous wife and the strong husband and all of the things that they can achieve together. And we all know Proverbs 31 woman, how she's owning her own business, she's doing her own thing, she's raising her family, and she's getting everything ready for the winter. These are serious maternal roles that women have neglected for far too long. I think that I distracted myself, but we do need a female role model who is like Jordan Peterson, and we need someone like Jordan Peterson to run for office in the US. The problem that we're seeing with the family in the West, and in the US specifically, is that they have been sold a false bill of goods, and now they're being told that the reason they're unhappy is because of all these other extenuating circumstances. We need someone who will show them that they are actually unhappy because of the actual lies they've been told and their outright rejection of, for example, gender roles, like actual male and actual female, positive masculinity, positive femininity. By rejecting these things, it's leading them to a shallower life that is genuinely nothing but hedonism and the pursuit of pleasure and these things that only make you happy for about 5 minutes at a time. And it's just sad to me to watch, but it also gives me a great deal of hope in that conservatives have what it takes to look at Gen Z and make the positive influence they need to. It's going to be very hard to rewrite a lot of these cultural mores that the left has put into place. They really have won. They've won. They've won the battle for hearts and minds. They've made it into public schools. They've made it into the thoughts of women. They've made it so that guys are weakened. They have really, really done incredible things. Like, seriously, hats off to them. I will not say more power to them because I hope that now this means that their time is at an end. I'm hoping that we're starting to realize that we have to culturally enforce from the ground up the concept that children are a blessing, the concept that abortion is a bad thing, that mothers and fathers are good, that marriage is an overall positive, the family is important, church is important. All of these things matter more than anything else. And I think that if we start from that ground up, and if we start in the grassroots environment of like going and building our own families, going and finding a church, something Andy and I are working on right now, going and building a home, building a family, and trying to make sure that you have this responsibility that you are lifting, I think that once we start to promote that and make it more popular, I think that there's no end to what conservatism can do in this world. I am conservative because I truly believe that these values are positive for the world. I would not push ideas on someone else that I thought would make them unhappy. I genuinely believe that these ideals are ultimately based in truth, which is something that I don't even believe that the left thinks. I think they know that what they're selling is not true. I think that they know that all of this talk of power and how the right only wants power is sheer projection. They are the ones who want power. This is exactly what they've exercised. You can see it in the way children are taught in schools. But anyway, I digress. We've come a long way from my beginning point, which is talking about dissecting the red wave. I do think that we tied it over from good GOP leadership to what it looks like going forward and how to make that positive influence on Gen Z. I talked about women coming over to the conservative side. We talked a little bit about Hispanics. What we really needed to keep a close eye on was Gen Z, because I forgot they're getting old enough to vote. It's a serious issue. And again, they've been lied to enough. It is our job now to tell them the truth and to demonstrate to them that these ideas that we have are positive. They're not just words on a page, that we are living out our own beliefs and it's having a positive impact in our lives. So I will leave you guys with that. I don't think I'm going to read a whole lot of comments. I've gotten quite a few. Thank you all for tuning in this evening. I had kind of a high viewership, higher than usual. Let me see what you guys had to say about my thoughts on Trump, because I will not walk them back. Let's see here. The issue isn't that Republicans didn't come out to vote. The issue was that they were outweighed by, for example, Gen Z, who really took it upon themselves to make it happen. More TDS. Yawn, more TDS. I don't have TDS. I voted for Donald Trump in 2020. I appreciated what he did. I appreciated that he took it to them as far as the culture war was concerned. And then he started to get behind the vaccine, which I'm sure everyone who was behind him loved the idea of him doing. He gave a blank check to Dr. Fauci. So many issues with his hiring choices. I genuinely still believe that he was the man for the job, and now is not his time anymore. I think that's just my 2 cents as far as that's concerned. Never had TDS, thought he was a fascinating character, often found him hilarious. He got a lot done. He did blow out the budget, which was a huge issue for me too, although apparently that's all out the window because now we can print as much as we need. Anyway, I knew tonight's video was going to be long, so thank you all for bearing with me if you did stick with me to the end. I think that the conservative approach has been underwhelming because the people who were pushing it were agreeable. I think that there was too much, live and let live. I think there was far too much free-handed whatever. I think that what we need to do now is live the example that we wanted to see in the world. I think what we need to do now is make sure that we are encouraging families, encouraging faith, encouraging, for example, living off the land, having families and viewing them as miraculous, and really caring about the people that we bring into the world. Like Tom McDonald talks about, we talk about leaving a better world for our kids, not leaving better kids for the world. I'm sure that's not original to him, but I think that there's definitely a good point to that. I think moving forward, there's a lot of work to be done, but as always, this starts at the ground up. We got to figure out the cultural change that we want to see in the world, and we need to figure out how to make it happen. And I'm genuinely convinced that that begins with each one of us individually. So let's go forward and make it happen. I think that that's a good note to end this on. I will see you guys tomorrow. Until next time, you know what I say. Bye, guys.